strangers from the internet are standing outside. The strangers from the internet have come from far and wide. But I cannot receive them. I hardly believe in them.
Hello, and welcome back to Shadow Yaddo. I'm Elena Richardson. This week, we're digging into the forensics of a new kind of noir, something I've been calling climate crime. The evidence is all around us, in the very air we breathe. We feel the eerie afterglow, the sense of cumulative dread, as the pendulum swings from the many ecological disasters we've witnessed in our lifetimes to ominous anticipation of what comes next. But we're not helpless and we're not inevitably stuck. To aid in our investigation and to illuminate a path forward, we've enlisted some tremendous talents. You'll hear the writer, Nathaniel Rich, whose riveting collection of narrative nonfiction, Second Nature, Scenes from a World Remade, came out last week. He'll be speaking with the intellectual powerhouse Philip Gourevitch, longtime staff writer for The New Yorker, former editor of the Paris Review, and author of several books, including The Ballad of Abu Ghraib. And throughout the episode, you'll hear sound art and music from Landfall, the genius collaboration between Laurie Anderson, icon, inventor, and NASA's first artist-in-residence, and the Kronos Quartet, whose founder, David Harrington, once said, "Of all the string quartets in the world, I'm intending to have the largest FBI file." Landfall came out in the wake of Hurricane Sandy, which ravaged the East Coast in October 2012. It was truly one of the most captivating live performances I've ever seen, and the 2019 Grammy Award-winning album is equally transporting. Here's track 28, Everything is Floating, written and performed by Laurie Anderson.
And after the storm, I went down to the basement. And everything was floating. Lots of my old keyboards, 30 projectors, props from old performances, a fiberglass plane, a motorcycle, countless papers and books. And I looked at them floating there in the shiny, dark water, dissolving. All the things I'd carefully saved all my life, becoming nothing but junk. And I thought, how beautiful. How magic, and how catastrophic.
Glow-in-the-dark bunnies, suicidal starfish, an epic rupture of methane gas, species return from extinction, saber-toothed tiger, anyone? And a ubiquitous chemical leaked by DuPont. Novelist and nonfiction writer Nathaniel Rich probes these phenomena and more in his latest book, Second Nature. He's in conversation here with one of my favorite minds, Philip Gourevitch, whose seminal reporting on the Rwandan genocide appears in his unforgettable book, We wish to inform you that tomorrow we will be killed with our families. As my old physics teacher used to say at the start of every lecture, listen and learn.
In some ways, Second Nature, your new book, which I've just read and is just terrific, it's partly about reclaiming Earth. It's about the idea that having, you could say, disfigured or altered or transformed the planet and the natural world beyond recognition, what do we do now that might actually take these technological and human developments and start to create something new that might be habitable? It interests me that at a certain point, you really started to develop these nonfiction pieces that you were probably starting out mostly doing as magazine things into sustained book writing.
Yeah, you put your finger on it. I mean, there's a moral valence here. We need to seek some kind of guiding direction for how to use these crazy new technologies that are already now being unleashed in, frightening ways often. And so it's really about coming to terms with just the weirdness of our reality now. I mean, a lot of these stories, as you said, started as magazine assignments. And what drew me to them originally was really, I was drawn by a sense of eeriness, uncanniness, stories that made me feel uncomfortable in some way.
It seems like one of the themes here also is imagination, which is that we're very poor at being able to imagine and care about what will happen in 50 years, never mind 500. What are we supposed to do about the scope and hard to imagine reach of these problems that we've created?
We all do. I mean, all of us who think about these things at all brush up against these horrors of the modern world that we all go through, which is this first a sense of, shock. You can't believe the scale of wrongdoing and the pervasiveness of it. A sense of disillusionment, and then a sense of anger, and also just a disquietude, especially the first part of the book. I saw them as crime stories. They're about people who are forced into this kind of disillusionment that causes them to reevaluate everything that they thought to be true about the natural world and try to find someone to blame. And it's not always easy to find someone to blame. And then it forces open a kind of larger question of to what extent is the blood on all of our hands? And yet the response is not to despair and curse one's fate. It's an incitement to greater dedication and action and obsession, frankly. And the stories really follow, well, what kind of forms does that take as people try to harness these same powers to, if not return things to the way they were, then at least try to imagine a better future, a healthier future, a more responsible future.
Yeah, I mean, I was very struck that a number of the characters are people who either have or find themselves of necessity putting a foot in the world that you might just think of as the enemy or the antagonist. In the story about Aspen, you have the character of Auden Chandler, who's a environmental activist in this, you portray it very comically, sort of wealthy resort town where people fly their poodles in from New York when they forget them on their ski trips, on their own private jets, they send it back, this sort of thing. But you have a guy who's basically committed to taking this environmentally damaging industry and trying, in a sense, to sustain the industry. He's got to make it green, like very green.
Yeah, I mean, that's a classic example of one of these stories that on first encounter, it just doesn't really sit right. You have the VP of Ski Co., the biggest business in Aspen, who's tasked with protecting snowfall, not just for Aspen, but for the American West, essentially, in centuries to come. And he's this big picture guy, and he sees it as his job is to stop global warming and use Aspen, the power and the money and influence of Aspen, to basically push the rest of the world into action. And so Auden has this idea, and he says, if Aspen doesn't lead, who's going to do it? Bangladesh? And it's like, it's this sort of borderline offensive, and yet there's something to that. And then the other aspect, of course, is people who lives in Aspen. It's not just like the Koch brothers. It's also every Saudi, Russian oil and gas magnate splashes out $35 million on some Aspen property. And so it's like, these are the people, the antichrists from an environmental activist standpoint that you're saying are going to save the world. Like, I think it's important to bring some skepticism. And yet he is able to do something spectacular. First of all, Aspen does become actually second or third city in the country or town to become 100% running on renewable energy. There's some asterisks sort of in there, like they import a lot of it from over the mountains, but nevertheless. And Chandler, yes, is able to convert a coal plant into a renewable energy plant with the help of a Koch brother who fought wind farms off the coast of his Nantucket house, setting that cause back for decades. But meanwhile is able to see that he's going to make profit. And sure enough, the coal company ends up going out of business after they make the deal. It's a good example of a story that doesn't sit right with you. And then you realize that, well, of course, with the level of transformational change that we need, there's going to be some uncomfortable alliances. There's going to be some moral compromise, really. And I find that's where the best stories live too. The best stories, frankly, are those where there's some tension. But, it's not just the good guys and the bad guys.
You started out, and will continue, I'm sure, probably have several in the works, writing novels. But as you've gotten into this particular material, you've really been drawn to the possibilities of narrative nonfiction as the way of approaching this stuff for the moment. And I wonder how you're thinking about that.
Yeah, I mean, it's great to meet these people. But yes, you could report in the same way and write fiction. And I've done that kind of fiction before. And what I think is crucial about it, a lot of my writing on these themes in this form really arose from a frustration that as a reader, which I guess is how a lot of people figure out what they want to write. They're frustrated they're not finding it. But there also hasn't been really any, as far as I know, narrative nonfiction directed at this subject either. And so I felt that's where I could make a contribution, that there's a lot of good science reporting, political reporting on environmental issues. There's a lot of memoir, as you said, and a lot of first-person journalists in the field. But there aren't stories about people that are where you really get into their lives about how their confrontation with these massive transformations and these forces that have been unleashed, how does that filter into one's own experience? And I think that with storytelling, with characters, my hope is that on the page, there's a life to them and it's three-dimensional. And so I try to get as close to them as possible. And, there's a lot of literature to draw from in this vein, including written by you, I should say. And people like Gay Talese or Joan Didion, there's a whole tradition of this kind of writing. It's just, this is the one major social issue that it hasn't received attention from writers who do that kind of writing. And I think it's a real loss.
I think because it's very hard, and you succeed, but it's very hard to bring it down to scale. In other words, it's got a cosmic element, and it's got the sort of get your mind around the overwhelming science of it and the pervasiveness of it, and the fact that although you think you're living on a piece of relatively untouched land, just as your last 4 generations did on the same piece of land, you're not outside these issues.
I think there's also like an inhibition writing about scientific themes, perhaps. It might also be a generational issue. There's been a kind of specialization of writing that perhaps flows out of the MFA idea that, you have to train in a very specific way for a very specific kind of writing. And once you're in that world, you better dare not go outside of that. I think the scale is probably the other part of it. But, you can say the same thing about anxiety over the atom bomb, say, or for that matter, look at the civil rights era, that just this extreme outpouring of literature that wasn't just the political writing and essays and reporting, but novels and deeply personal work. And there's not a corresponding literature yet with climate change or with broader ecological shift that we're in. And it's not because there's not a desire either for it. This unsettled quality that we have when we read about, to take some examples from the book, this massive gas leak in southern Los Angeles that nobody really notices, but is actually like the biggest climate disaster in recent American history, or like this re-engineering bunny rabbits to glow green, or these efforts to completely reconstruct the Louisiana coast. I think part of it has to do with the fact that we're not really talking about the issues in a serious way. They seem novelties, or people use terms like this is like sci-fi or
everything's like sci-fi now. I mean, look,
right.
Here we are. You're in New Orleans. I'm upstate New York. We're like talking on a podcast. All this stuff didn't exist. We're almost too familiar with and dependent on the technologies to be able to imagine how we could do without the things that are killing us.
Right. Those are deeply unexamined issues. And I feel like if you're writing a book today about whether it's nonfiction or fiction, and there's not some at least sense of this transformation in the story, you're not totally being honest. I mean, the weirdness of the present, I think you have to be alive to it.
There was a line you quote in the chapter about the wasting disease that affects sea stars in the waters off of the coastal Pacific, where they say basically, nobody can explain what's happening to these sea stars. She says, if we're not able to predict something as significant as this, what else don't we see coming? It's one of those places where it really does link the very concrete thing of like, here are these sea stars in these tidal pools. And then here's this whole cosmic dilemma that all around us everywhere, we need to be able to see not just what's coming, but where we want to go.
Yes. And the sea stars are a good example because it's the kind of thing where, you have school children who all along the Pacific coast go tide pooling, look for these beautiful creatures. And all of a sudden the sea stars started just killing themselves in the most gruesome ways. And
no, it is like a Simpsons field trip, like you take them all to see the nice little sea stars and the sea stars start literally dismembering themselves. Right.
Yeah. Just tearing off their own arms. Everyone thinks it's probably has to do with climate change, and yet they have not been able to confirm it, and there's countervailing evidence along the way. And so it captured for me this idea of just, we know what's happening here is wrong, but we don't really know exactly why it's happening or how to fix it. And how do we live with this dread and horror? The other fascinating thing is this one theory that mainly through overfishing, we've created circumstances where these species are no longer encumbered and have overpopulated. And so that it may be that this massive die-off is actually a correction to a historical mean rather than an aberration. It's like turtles all the way down. Like you can always go back and find a different version of reality. And part of the challenge is, which version of reality do you want to call natural? What are we trying to get back to exactly? Because there's nothing natural about the Pacific waters and the population of sea stars in 1930, just as there's nothing natural about them today.
Right. It's like a lot of historical nostalgias, right? I mean, where most of all, modernity has been a narrative of progress. We say we might wish that things looked like they did in the 19th century on some aspect of wilderness or the natural world, but we don't really want to live with 19th century medicine and childbirth. Those things have improved. Most of the things we like, we don't want to give up. And yet, we're nostalgic for something that actually may have been produced by this whole process.
Right. And yet there's something terrifying about empowering anybody or any government to say, we decree that a natural forest should look like this, or the Pacific water ecosystem should look like that. We're at the point of ecosystem engineering already. And so it's unsettling, the idea of saying, well, there should be this many sea stars per square acre or whatever, however you would do it. But at a certain point, some decisions have to be made. And so we have to figure out how we're going to do that. And it's not enough just to sort of let things fall where they may.
I mean, in many ways, it's the same conversation people have when they say, coal is doomed. Let's accelerate the doom of coal. And then somebody says, but there are all these people whose daddies and granddaddies and great-granddaddies mined coal in West Virginia or where have you, and you're going to wipe out a whole community. And you're like,
right.
Yeah, but you can't preserve.
Right. And I always like to say with the coal industry, you forget that there are fewer people working in coal industry than there are yoga teachers in the United States, for instance.
Well, that's the first good news you've reported.
And this is something that the Green New Deal people have seized upon, actually, to their credit. They have a whole platform about helping these workers
become yoga teachers.
Because, yeah, the coal to yoga pipeline.
Right.
Thanks for tuning in. Big thanks to our sound engineer, CJ DeGenero, and to the artists who contributed music. In order of appearance, they are Joseph Keckler for the adaptation of our theme music, Strangers from the Internet, Laurie Anderson and Kronos Quartet for selections from Landfall, which is available on Bandcamp, iTunes, Amazon, and other platforms. Laurie's 1982 debut album, Big Signs, was just reissued in a remastered red vinyl edition from None Such Records. But we'll leave you with the last track from Landfall, a haunting composition that manages to capture both the devastation of a natural disaster and a sense of grace and celestial scope. You'll hear a mode of rescue hovering above, and perhaps realize, as I did, that we can rescue ourselves and the planet. We just need to be prepared to pay the bill, to take action, and to trust in facts. Here's Old Motors and Helicopters. I'm a huge cynic, but I do believe in reality. And as we emerge from one pandemic, let's not be blind to the other threats that have been barreling towards us for decades now. Let's not stick our heads back in the sand. Let's get serious, stay optimistic, and take on the challenges of these times. I'm in if you're in. In the meantime, take care of yourself and others. We'll see you for more Shadow Yaddo in a couple of weeks.